A woman mysteriously disappeared on her way home. Her friends began a search, and later the police joined them. Everyone hoped that she was okay and would soon return home. But within a few days, such horrific details emerged in the case that even experienced detectives were shocked. Today, we will tell you what happened to Gemma McCluskie and why this case shook all of Britain. Gemma McCluskie was born on February 5, 1983 in England. She grew up in a large family. The girl had 2 older brothers and loving parents. In her teenage years, Gemma decided to try herself as an actress, and in 1997, she got a few minor roles. In 2000, when she was 17, she was offered a role in one of the most popular British TV series called EastEnders. In total, Gemma appeared in more than 30 episodes. After that, she had to temporarily give up her acting career because her mother became seriously ill and someone had to take care of her. The woman was diagnosed with a brain tumor, which was successfully operated on, but unfortunately, she got infected during the operation, which could not be treated. Since then, Gemma lived in an apartment with her mother and brother Tony. She worked as a waitress in several bars and clubs, and her brother took care of their mother in her absence. In March 2012, when Gemma was 29, she was, as usual, taking care of her mother, going to work, and occasionally meeting with friends. But one day her acquaintances realized that no one could reach Gemma. She didn't answer her phone, didn't respond to messages on social media, and didn't appear online. She had quite a few friends, and they quickly suspected something was wrong. Together, they concluded that no one had seen Gemma for several days. The last time she met with her friend, Erica, was on March 1st, and since then, Gemma had not been seen or heard from. On March 3rd, her brother went to the club where she was supposed to work that day, but the staff said that Gemma never showed up. That's when Tony and his brother, Danny, decided to go to the police. They knew that their sister would never leave their sick mother without warning, so they doubted that she had just left on her own. Investigators received a report of a missing person and first questioned Tony, whose testimony was crucial as he lived with Gemma and could have been the last person to see her. However, there was a problem. For many years, Tony had been using marijuana in large quantities, and the entire family knew about his addiction. Because of this habit, he constantly experienced problems with memory and concentration, so he couldn't even remember the specific day he last saw Gemma. Eventually, he remembered seeing his sister on March 1st. On that day, as usual, he had consumed a large amount of marijuana and nearly caused a flood in the apartment. Tony decided to fill the bathtub and forgot about it, causing water to overflow. But luckily, Gemma was home and turned off the water. After that, she left the apartment to meet her friend Erica. Tony said he left his room around 6 p.m. and his sister was still missing. Gemma and Erica discussed the bathtub incident, and Gemma once again complained about how tired she was of her brother's behavior. He worked as a window cleaner, but spent almost all his money on marijuana, even though he was 35 years old, and Gemma often felt like she had to constantly look after him. The next day, after reporting to the police, Erica met with Tony to discuss the situation again and try to think together about where his sister could have gone. The man was depressed, often started crying, and blamed himself for what had happened. He said that because of the bathtub incident, Gemma once again became disappointed in him. It was not the first time that his addiction had upset his relatives. Meanwhile, Gemma's friends turned to the local newspaper, asking to write about her disappearance. Reporters spoke to Gemma's brother and wrote an article. Everyone hoped that media coverage would help find witnesses who might have seen the woman. On March 5th, Gemma's cousins decided to organize large-scale searches. They attracted dozens of volunteers who searched the streets and handed out flyers to passerby. The sisters also actively disseminated information through social networks, hoping to get any leads. On March 6th, they did receive their first lead, but not in the form they had hoped. Tony received a call from an unknown number, telling him that if he wanted to see his sister alive, he needed to bring £2 million sterling to the Benefit railway station, located outside of London. Shortly after, there was a second call from the same unknown person, stating that in addition to the money, he also needed to bring $500 in Iraqi currency. After this, there was a third call, in which the mysterious person threatened to kill Gemma if they didn't get the money. Tony asked to speak to his sister, but the caller said that she was locked in another room and added that the woman was regularly subjected to violence, so he advised Tony to hurry with the money. The same person also called Danny, the missing woman's other brother. The police tried to trace these calls. Despite the fact that the number was hidden in all cases, they quickly managed to find the caller. He was a 19-year-old boy named Sam Dunn, who lived in Kent County. His home was relatively close to the railway station where the caller demanded the money to be brought. A judge issued a search warrant for his home, and Dunn was arrested. However, soon after, the police came to the conclusion that the boy had nothing to do with Gemma's disappearance, as he admitted during interrogation. He and his friends saw a post on social media about the woman's disappearance and decided to play a prank. There were two numbers, Tony and Danny. However, investigators quickly discovered that there were inaccuracies in this story as well. The boy said that the calls were made by his friend, and he was just sitting next to him. The police established that the caller was actually Sam, and could not find any other people involved. As a result, the court did not appreciate his joke and sentenced the boy to 6 months in prison. The detectives once again had no leads. They recreated the chronology of that day and established that Gemma left Erica's apartment at around 13:17 and went home along the way. She called Tony several times and arrived at her home at 13:50. This was confirmed by CCTV footage. After 18 minutes, her phone was turned off, and it had not been turned on since. At that point, the police were almost certain that Gemma had been abducted, but there was something strange about the timing of her movements. Most likely, her abductor had turned off her phone, but how could he have done that 18 minutes after the woman arrived home? The most logical explanation would be that Gemma was attacked right in her apartment. But at that time, Tony was there, and their mother was in the hospital. Investigators came to an alarming conclusion and thought, could her own brother have something to do with her disappearance? He consumed a lot of weed, and people with serious addictions are often capable of monstrous acts. Digging deeper, detectives learned that Gemma's sister and mother had called the police on Tony several times. Sometimes he behaved aggressively and even attacked Gemma. The brothers' behavior during the investigation also raised questions. While Denny and Gemma's friends were actively involved in the search, Tony sat at home. He explained that he hoped for Gemma's return and wanted to be at home in case she came back. Only after the case began to be talked about on major TV channels did he finally join the search. Police spoke to him again, trying to get more specific answers about the timeline of events on that day. Tony said he saw his sister between 1:30 p.m. and 3 p.m., and after that she went somewhere. Considering that her phone was turned off at 2:08 p.m., his story raised questions. On the other hand, Tony was under the influence of weed almost 24/7, and relying on his memory would not be entirely objective. On March 6th, 5 days after Gemma's disappearance, there was an extremely alarming turn in the case. A boatman was sailing along one of London's canals, and at some point a suitcase hit his boat. Upon collision, it opened, and the shocked boatman saw its contents. There was a human body inside. Experts examined it and immediately noticed that the torso was missing its head, legs, and arms. It was a female body with a bow tattoo on the lower back, the same as Gemma's. So investigators immediately requested DNA analysis to identify the body. They took DNA from her toothbrush and obtained a complete match. The deceased was Gemma McCluskie. Her relatives and friends were shocked by the news of the woman's death and the gruesome details of her body being found in a suitcase. No one could believe that something so terrible had happened to her. Now the police were dealing with a murder case, and everyone was waiting for them to catch the culprit. The very next day, on March 7th, they made a loud statement. Investigators announced that Tony McCluskie had been arrested on suspicion of murder. His inability to remember the timeline of that day and strange behavior during the search for Gemma suggested that he was not at all interested in finding his own sister, or he knew that she was already dead. In addition, the time frame of her disappearance made Tony the most obvious suspect. Given that he had a fight about the overflowing bathtub that day, as well as his known addiction, police assumed that he might have snapped and killed his sister. The use of marijuana in large quantities over a long period of time can lead to serious mental problems, and a person is fully capable of committing spontaneous crimes. During the first interrogation, detectives became even more convinced that Tony could indeed be the killer. Instead of denying his guilt in his sister's murder, he answered all questions with one short phrase: no comment. Investigators examined his smartphone, where they found correspondence with his sister. The day after her disappearance, he sent Gemma a message saying, "I love you." And a few hours later, he wrote, "Gem, call me when you get this message. What do we have for dinner today? Are you working tonight?" Detectives noticed one strange fact. Their correspondence with his sister dated back many years, but he never once wrote that he loved her, only on the day after her disappearance. On the same day, he wrote to his girlfriend and apologized for not getting in touch with her the night before. None of this pointed to his guilt, but soon police found much more serious evidence. They learned that on the day of Gemma's disappearance, Tony ordered a taxi to an address near the house using a fake name, Tom. Learning the route from the company, investigators obtained recordings from surveillance cameras in the area. On the first frames of the footage taken during the man's taxi ride, they saw Tony loading a large suitcase into the trunk. It was clear that it was very heavy, and the driver's testimony confirmed this fact. Seeing the man struggling to lift the suitcase, he asked him, "What's inside?" Tony claimed it was a large music system. He asked to be taken to the street next to the canal, where his sister's body would later be found. After questioning the locals in the area, the police found one witness, a student who was standing on the balcony of her apartment, saw a man dragging a large suitcase towards the canal. Experts examined the taxi trunk and found traces of blood. DNA analysis showed that it belonged to Gemma. With these clues in hand, detectives were convinced that Tony was transporting the same suitcase with his sister's body, and on March 10th, he was charged with murder. The police conducted a search of their apartment and found even more alarming evidence: a knife with barely noticeable traces of blood, and there were also bloodstains in the bathroom that they tried to wash away. All of this indicated that the woman was killed in her own home, but one moment raised questions for the detectives. Given that the woman's head, arms, and legs were separated from the body, there should have been much more blood. Experts studied the drainage pipes throughout the house, but they did not find significant traces of blood there. They speculated that Tony laid something like plastic wrap or tarp on the bathroom floor, and then gradually disposed of the blood with a large amount of cleaning agents. The day after the murder, Tony was caught on store cameras buying trash bags. According to investigators, he could use them to carry out the remaining parts of the body from the house. Soon this version was confirmed. Divers who continued to search the canal found bags with legs and arms at the bottom of the same canal. Even without DNA analysis, everyone already understood that they belonged to Gemma, and later, laboratory experts only confirmed this fact. Despite a serious set of evidence against Tony, he still did not speak to investigators, and they decided to change tactics. The police showed his father footage from cameras where Tony was seen putting the suitcase in the taxi trunk on the day of Gemma's murder. The father was convinced that his son was involved in the murder, so he agreed to talk to him and try to get a confession. This tactic worked, but only partially. During the conversation, Tony told his father what had happened that day. According to him, Gemma came home and started to fight over the bathtub being full, demanding that her brother move out of her apartment, but he refused. When Tony decided to go to his room, Gemma allegedly grabbed a knife and he didn't remember anything after that. Investigators didn't believe this story for a second, as it sounded like an attempt to shift the blame for the murder. Therefore, they continued to search for additional evidence. On March 9th, police found Gemma's head in the same canal, and experts were finally able to determine the cause of death. The woman had received several blows with a sharp object, and the injuries matched the kitchen knife found in her apartment. Since then, detectives have been preparing the case for trial, and Tony has been in custody. The trial lasted almost a year, during which time the victim's brother gradually began to admit his guilt. He constantly exchanged letters with his father, but continued to insist that he didn't remember the moment of the murder. Nevertheless, Tony admitted that he was the one who killed his sister. According to him, during the argument, he essentially blacked out and couldn't control himself. Tony insisted that he never wanted his sister to die and couldn't have done such a thing in a sane state of mind. The trial began in January 2013. The prosecution believed that Tony flew into rage during the argument with his sister when she asked him to move out of the apartment. Given his penchant for marijuana, he simply wouldn't have had enough money to rent his own place. Perhaps this played a significant role in what happened next. Based on the experts' conclusions, the prosecution claimed that Tony stabbed his sister several times, leading to her death. He then laid something like a tarp in the bathroom and took the body there, after which he dismembered it. Based on CCTV footage, Tony put Gemma's torso in a suitcase and threw it into the canal. After that, he carried other body parts and other evidence in garbage bags over several trips, some of which he also threw into the water. His father couldn't even bear to listen to it all. He left the courtroom and only returned after they stopped discussing the details of his daughter's murder. Tony himself admitted that he was most likely the one who killed Gemma, but he didn't remember it at all. According to him, it could have been self-defense, as his sister allegedly shouted at him with a knife in her hand, and what happened next was unknown. The prosecution considered his version to be a blatant lie. A psychotherapist was invited as a witness who claimed that memory loss due to marijuana use is extremely rare. In addition, Tony clearly planned to hide what he had done by getting rid of the body. It took him many hours, and amnesia and a state of shock should have passed fairly quickly. Not only did he dismember her body and scatter it around different places of the canal, but he also called a taxi under a false name and thoroughly cleaned the bathroom floor afterward. All of this indicated that Tony was fully aware of what he was doing and planned to avoid punishment by getting rid of all possible evidence. Gemma's childhood friend also testified in court, revealing that her brother had been beating and humiliating her from an early age. Sometimes Gemma had to wear sunglasses to hide the signs of physical abuse. According to the witness, Tony always despised his sister and felt no emotions toward her. He lived with her and their mother only because it was convenient for him. He didn't have to pay rent or even for food. Tony spent almost all of his salary on weed, and this lifestyle suited him perfectly. But when his sister tried to kick him out, he snapped and killed her. The trial ended on January 30th, and the jury found Tony guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 20 years. In his closing statement, the judge said that Tony disposed of the victim's body like a true maniac and apparently hoped it would never be found. The killer showed no emotion during the reading of the verdict or the trial itself. There was no evidence that he felt any remorse for what he had done. After Tony began serving his sentence, he was transferred from one prison to another because someone had put a price on his head. It is unknown whether this was related to the murder of Gemma or if he had quarreled with other inmates. Tony's father, who had tried to support his son throughout the trial, ultimately decided to cut off all contact with him. The man said that he did not want to turn away from Tony, as he would lose 2 children at once, and besides, he was his own son, and he simply could not abandon him. But in the end, he realized that Tony felt no remorse for what he had done. He didn't care about his own sister at all. In the same year, their mother passed away after a prolonged illness, but even then, Tony did not seem to have any strong feelings. It appeared that his own family did not matter to him at all. The worst part is that none of this can be blamed on drug addiction. He had been humiliating and abusing Gemma since childhood, so there is no justification for what he did. Tony's brother and father are forced to live the rest of their lives with the realization of what kind of monster Tony really is. Feel free to share your opinion on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.